Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I guess we'll start with any latecomers come. They can just filter in here. Get the few remaining seats there are. Does anyone have any announcements, any joys or concerns? Anyone? Okay. Well, if not, I guess we'll get started with our service. Join me in the call to worship. We may come here for a glimpse of glory.
Can you drink the cup that I drink? Can you drink the cup that I drink?
The cup of Jesus' own life, struggle and joy, suffering and hope, fullness of life. We may come here to get close to Jesus.
And Jesus asks us, can we be baptized with my baptism?
Baptized into the reign of God, where the Spirit breaks down barriers among all people and creates new relationships. We may come here for honor or fame.
But Jesus challenges us to become great, we must serve.
Why are we here?
To drink the cup of fullness of life, to immerse ourselves in Jesus' struggle for justice and peace, to learn how to serve so that the world may be healed.
I
for all who suffer. Meet us here today and fill us with confidence in your presence, that we may risk sharing Jesus' cup and his baptism, so the world may become the place of love and justice you desire for all. Shelter us with your light and clothe us with your heavenly garments. Teach us how we may best serve ourselves and one another on this daring adventure. Amen. Divine Shepherd, like sheep, we go on our ways, with our heads to the ground and our attention turned elsewhere. We often fail to heed the gentle nudge of your staff and your calls for home. With so many things to distract us, work, school, and the general busyness of life, we lie unresponsive to your calls to kingdom service. Amen. Protector Jesus, you came among us in order to shelter us from the cold of night and forests of danger. In your presence, we are in green pastures. In you, we are forgiven and called once again to serve and create with you a world of justice and peace for all. Amen. Let us praise God. First scripture lesson comes from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. The second lesson comes from Hebrews chapter 5. Every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins, as well as for those of the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what Hem suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And our gospel lesson comes from Mark, the 10th chapter. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
In a book called The Critical Years, Sharon Parks writes about going to Harvard as a new chaplain and ending up at a faculty reception where she felt nervous and out of place. She was sitting in the corner when an older, well-known faculty member came and sat down beside her. He started a conversation, and soon they were talking about his son, who had just started college in another state. The professor talked about how hard it was for him to let the boy go off to school and how much he worried about him. Parks found herself saying, "Oh, well, don't worry. Whatever the worst thing is that you've imagined might happen to him, won't. It will be something else." Looking back on it now, she says it seemed like a stupid thing to say, but he jumped on it right away. "Good," he said, "because I've already decided what the worst thing would be." "Oh, really?" Parks answered. "And what is that?" "The worst thing," the man said, "would be for him to come to the place where it was no longer possible for him to make meaning." Parks uses that conversation to launch a long discussion about the ability to make meaning, something she calls faith. I talk about this regularly in the new members class I teach at my church. Tell those new members that we all have some way of making sense of the world we live in, some framework of understanding on which to hang our experience. If we step outside and a bird flies past, we might say, "Oh, yes, that's right, birds fly." And we hang that experience in its proper place on the framework. But if we step outside and a cat flies past, we don't know what to do. We either, one, reject the experience out of hand, that didn't really happen, or two, we invent a sensible explanation, that cat wasn't really flying, someone just threw it across my field of vision, or three, we reconstruct our framework of understanding to include flying cats. But in each case, our brain is working to make sense of something that appears to be nonsense. It has to. Because when we can no longer make sense of our experience, we can no longer function in the world. And Sharon Parks uses the word faith to identify this meaning-making ability. She uses it in a broader sense than we usually do. She would say that even the atheist has a faith, a framework on which to hang his experience. She would only add that in his experience there is no evidence of a good and loving God. In fact, his experience of the world leads him to just the opposite conclusion. How could a good and loving God allow all the violence and hatred that exists in the world, he argues? How could a good and loving God allow something like the Holocaust? And because there aren't really any good answers to that question, he rejects the idea of God completely and constructs a framework of understanding that does not include the supernatural. And for the atheist, at least, it makes a lot more sense to look at the world that way than to imagine a God who won't rescue his own people from annihilation. A godless world fits his experience. It becomes his faith. Not to say that he's right about that. There is another way to look at the world, and it's the way the Bible looks at it. The Bible presents the world as the gift of an all-powerful and all-loving Creator who wanted nothing more than to be in relationship with the people he had made. When they rejected him the first time, he decided to start over again. He flooded the world and saved one man who had found favor in his eyes. His hope was that this man would teach his children to love and serve the Lord, and they in turn would teach their children, and so on and so forth until the whole world was filled with good and godly people. It didn't work. But this time, instead of starting over, God started with one man among many and promised him an inheritance and an inheritor if he would only stay faithful. He did. And through Abraham came Isaac, and then Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. Through his 12 sons came the 12 tribes of a new nation, who were delivered from their slavery in Egypt and brought into the promised land. They settled there. They raised crops and reared children. They crowned a king who laid claim to more land. But then the kingdom was divided, and the kings became corrupt, and the Assyrians conquered the north, and the Babylonians conquered the south, and they were taken into exile so that it looked as if all was lost until a remnant returned to the land and worked to rebuild Israel. And through the years they nourished the hope that one day all would be well again, that a king would take the throne who would restore the nation to its former glory, a king whose name would be Messiah. Whew. That biblical faith is the faith the disciples were living with. That's the way they made sense of the world. And the reason they were so excited is that they believed Jesus was that king. As they followed him around, as they witnessed his mighty works, they became more and more convinced that he was, in fact, the one they had been waiting for all those years. And when Peter came right out and said it, "You're the Messiah," Jesus did not deny it. That's when the disciples began to get really excited. If Jesus was, in fact, the long-awaited Messiah, then all their dreams were about to come true. He would march into the city of Jerusalem, get rid of those meddling Romans. He would drive them out of the country and take his place on the throne of his ancestor David. And then, of course, there would be places of privilege for all those who had stuck with him through his long campaign. There would be thrones to his left and thrones to his right. Now, if this were your framework of understanding, can you see how you would have no place to hang the idea of a crucified Messiah? When Jesus announced that he was going to Jerusalem, you would think, yes, Jerusalem, the royal city where the throne of David is, where the Messiah will begin his reign. It all made perfect sense. But when he began to talk about being handed over to the chief priests and scribes, when he began to talk about being condemned to death, when he began to talk about being mocked and flogged and killed, well, it was like watching a cat fly past. The disciples had to, one, reject the comment out of hand. He didn't really say that. Two, invent a sensible explanation, it's just a figure of speech. Or 3, reconstruct their framework of understanding to include a crucified Messiah, something they just could not do. And so they opted for one of the other explanations and went forward with their assumptions of impending glory. We need to be careful not to judge them too quickly or too harshly. It is a difficult thing to alter the framework of your understanding, and it is always a risk. While you are reaching across the empty space to put a new girder in place with a wrench in one hand and a bolt between your teeth, the whole thing could collapse. And you know what that means, right? The definition of insanity is not trying the same thing over and over again in the hope that you will get a different result, as Albert Einstein once joked. The definition of insanity is the inability to make meaning, which is a far more serious thing. And without a framework of understanding, you can't do it. You can't make sense of your world anymore. That's what this professor was so afraid of in Sharon Park's story, that his son would come to the place where it was no longer possible for him to make meaning, that his framework of understanding that his father had helped him build through the years would be torn down by those who weren't nearly so thoughtful or careful. They might put up another rickety framework in its place, or leave the boy standing in the wreckage of the old one. When you can't make meaning anymore, then every experience is a flying cat experience, and you just go crazy, become unglued. Maybe it would be better not to take that risk. Maybe it would be better to leave things just as they are. It is under those circumstances that James and John come to Jesus just after he has told them for the 3rd time that he is going to suffer and die. "Teacher," they say, ignoring his last comment, "we want you to do us a favor." "What is it?" Jesus asks, his mind on other things. "When you come into your glory," they ask, "could we have the thrones on either side of you, the ones on the left and the right?" And Jesus stops in the road and stares at them. Are they insane? Didn't he just say he was going to suffer and die in Jerusalem? Haven't they heard anything? There is a long silence before he answers, and when he does, he tries another approach. "Can you drink the cup that I drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" We know exactly what he means. He's talking about the cup of suffering. He's talking about baptism by fire. But James and John don't seem to have a clue. Or maybe they are just in deep denial. "Sure," they say, "no problem." And Jesus shakes his head with wonder and also with sadness. "Oh, you'll drink the cup, all right," he says, "and you will experience the baptism, but as for who gets the thrones,